When you think of a territorial dispute, you often think of a conflict over land. But here in Southeast Asia lies what's known as the South China Sea. And if you want to know who controls the waters, well, good luck. It's going to depend on who you ask. These are all of the countries that claim a piece of the South China Sea. Well, except China, which claims nearly all of it. And in recent years, China doubled down on that claim by building man-made islands with military facilities. In 2017 alone, these construction projects covered 72 acres. These new islands have made surrounding nations and even the United States pretty nervous. So what is it about this small body of water that makes it so desirable? For one, it's a massive shipping passage with $5.3 trillion worth of trade cruising through its waters every year. That's nearly 1/3 of all global maritime trade. Second is, well, what's below the surface? Lots and lots of oil and natural gas. How much exactly? The US estimates there's 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in the South China Sea, while one Chinese government-owned oil company actually put the figure closer to 125 billion barrels of oil and 500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in undiscovered areas. And when you think China consumes about 4.5 billion barrels of oil annually, well, that could potentially mean several decades worth of energy. So it's understood why the South China Sea is one of the most disputed places on the planet, but why is its ownership left open for interpretation? According to international law, every country has the right to claim up to 12 nautical miles from its coast as its territory. Meanwhile, a country can claim an exclusive economic zone extending up to 200 nautical miles for things like mining or fishing. That's the law most governments around the South China Sea are following. But China's government says they have an exception. The 9-dash line. The 9-dash line, originally the 11-dash line, first appeared on a Chinese map about 70 years ago. Now, Beijing argues this serves as historical evidence that it has a claim to up to 90% of the contested waters. The line is less than 200 miles away from some coastal areas of Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, yet it reaches as far as 1,200 miles from the south of mainland China. So that's why in 2016, an international tribunal voted against China, saying it has no legal basis for its claims. Most of the region welcomed the news, but the Chinese government pretty much pretended the ruling never happened, building more artificial islands and bases since. American allies in the area might hope that the US will get involved, but Chinese officials recently gave the Trump administration a warning. The more ships the US brings to the contested waters, the more China will step up its presence. Hey guys, it's Upton. Thanks for watching. For more of our videos, check out What is Alibaba Here and What Does China Own in Australia here. We're also taking suggestions for future CNBC Explains, so leave your comments in the section below. And while you're at it, subscribe to our channel.
Okay, we're back. We're live with Think Tech Asia here on a given Tuesday, and we have the honor of talking again to our old friend Michael Davis, Professor Michael Davis, Professor of International Law at the University of Hong Kong. He joins us by Skype. Thanks for being around, Michael.
Oh, you're welcome. Nice to be back on Think Tech.
Good. You know, I mean, we've had some extraordinary news in the International Law Department, namely what the court in The Hague did. The tribunal in The Hague did on the claims asserted by the Philippine government and others over China's action in the South China Seas, specifically on Scarborough Island and other areas in that neighborhood. You wrote an article for Insight called Damage Control. So we're going to call this show Damage Control in the South China Sea. What do you think?
Yeah, this article was in the South China Morning Post. Yeah, the Insight is just a section. Yeah. right. And yeah, it's been a big problem. There's a need for damage control.
Well, yeah. So you mentioned, and this I'd like to cover this with you if we can in our half hour. You mentioned that there are 10 points worthy of consideration, and they're all beyond the ordinary press. I must say this has not been covered in the ordinary press, and we ought to cover it today. One, for example, and I'll go down the list with you. You talked about the UN Convention and exactly what it provides, and the fact that China is a member. What's the story on that?
Yes, I mean, China, of course, a few decades ago was trying to come out of its Cultural Revolution, trying to become a sort of normal country. And among many things it wanted to do was to sign on to international treaties and be a part of the international community. And the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is one of those. Should note, the U.S. is not a member of that. This treaty has been stuck in the U.S. Congress now for decades because I have to say Republicans in Congress are reluctant to sign on to multilateral treaties. In spite of that, the U.S. claims that it adheres to the treaty more or less. It just, as a matter of customary law, I suppose, not even customary law, just that it's claiming to adhere. So China is a member, and all these countries along the South China Sea likewise are members. The Philippines, who brought this case, is a member. So they're basically an effort here to enforce a treaty. Now, why would China join such a treaty? Well, one of the things about this treaty we call UNCLOS, or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, is that it extended, in the old days, there used to be 3-mile territorial seas along countries, and then there were some countries extending it to 12. UNCLOS makes it 12. And then it has these exclusive economic zones that go out 200 nautical miles and gives the countries, the adjoining countries, control over all the resources in the area, both under the continental shelf and in the sea, in the water column. So all of that would be very attractive to China as it was emerging from its dark days.
Yeah, interesting that they would join the convention, that the U.S. would not join the convention, and now they have essentially abrogated. But before we move on to point 2, which is along those same lines, doesn't it undermine our moral authority, our moral suasion here, to be complaining about what China does when we ourselves are not a member of the convention?
Yeah, this has been brought up a lot, as sort of a hypocrisy sort of argument. I think this argument gets you only so far at the end of the day. I mean, China basically has to have relations with its neighbors, and claiming all of the seas, South China Sea, along their coast doesn't really improve those relations. So I think China has to look at this on its own. The U.S. Has been a problem when it comes to multilateral treaties, largely, again, like these treaties get blocked in Congress or reservations are attached to them that in effect vitiate them. But in spite of that, the U.S. more or less follows the principles here. And getting hung up on that, I think, would be a mistake for China. I think it should focus on the problem at hand.
Yes, and the problem at hand. So China is a member of the convention, and China is obligated then to arbitrate under that. Very simple. Member, you agree to certain things, and one of them is arbitration. But China has not arbitrated. What is their defense for that, that obligation?
Well, they claim the Philippines is bringing a case that violates or in effect denies that the tribunal should not have jurisdiction for, and they claim this for 2 reasons. One is that this is really a dispute over who owns the islands, that is sovereignty, and this treaty does not cover territory, island territory. It only covers the sea. And there are a lot of rights in the sea that attach to land, but at the end of the day, it has nothing to say about who owns the island, who's sovereign. And the other claim they have is they are allowed to put a reservation when they sign on to the treaty that in effect says that they do not subject themselves to this dispute mechanism when it comes to questions of delimitation of whose water is what, whose area is what in the sea. But however, the provision that they signed on to merely talks about when their zones overlap and delimiting overlapping areas in the sea. And the tribunal took the view in response to these two things that they're both wrong. One is they're not going to decide and did not decide who owns the islands in the area. And two, there were no overlapping, what we call exclusive economic zones. So that's all. And the tribunal, therefore, was not barred from taking jurisdiction. In fact, it was bound to take jurisdiction under the treaty if a member state brought an action.
They made a kind of a special appearance, though, didn't they? China made an appearance to contest jurisdiction, and I guess that runs parallel to some of the procedures we have in the United States. They didn't acknowledge jurisdiction; they only appeared to say that there was no jurisdiction. On the other hand, I think it was a false argument anyway.
Yeah, they filed some kind of statement about this, but they didn't formally appear in the case, and so they were. And they never did appear. It was actually comparable to the way the U.S. handled the Nicaragua case years ago involving Contra rebels and all this, where the United States was brought before that tribunal, and the U.S. Said no. It appeared actually and said that and challenged jurisdiction and lost. It challenged it because the U.S. had a reservation to the relevant treaties that said it would not accept the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction when involving a multilateral treaty, where the court says, well, this is also customary law that you not, invade another country. Yeah. And so the U.S. lost on that. This is brought up frequently by China because then the U.S. actually didn't appear further and withdrew from the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. So the U.S. is setting a sort of bad example here again.
Yes.
But
on China's part, it seems to me there's a little disingenuous to be a member and then, to contest jurisdiction and then not to appear at all. Wouldn't they have been better off, on a substantive basis? I mean, it smells like from the very outset they knew they were going to lose this case because they don't have a good claim. But wouldn't it have been better for them to appear and go through the procedure the way everybody else did?
I would have thought so. I guess then they wouldn't have the argument that they're going to ignore it and they're attacking this judgment vociferously, saying that it's an illegal one, that the tribunal was constituted illegally. One of the problems is that if they join in the case, then they have a right to participate in the selection of the arbitrators, the judges. By not appearing, they didn't have that right, and so instead that was left to the president of the Law of the Sea Court, and this person happens to be Japanese, so that, of course, China has disputes over the sea with Japanese as well. So, but the arbitrators he selected seemed very respectable, mostly from Europe, one from Africa, and so it didn't seem like a sweetheart deal at all. It seemed very above board. And when you read the decision, my God, the decision goes on for 500 pages. So when you read it, you can see they were very, very thorough. And as I argue in this op-ed, I actually think it would have been still is to China's advantage to use this decision. Now, they could have shaped it better if they had participated. Perhaps their arguments would have been more forceful, or the judges that were selected would have been more sympathetic. But at the end of the day, because now the judges that were selected reached a unanimous decision in this case. Yeah. At the end of the day, I think there's a lot of ways out for China on this, and if they read the judgment carefully, it doesn't seem like they have. It's really is not as bad as they make it out to be.
Yeah, and your point, which we'll get to in a minute, is that this is a platform for negotiation, that it is not a matter of using force or defending against force or having a real set-to about it. Rather, this is a good start for negotiation. And I think that's a very good contribution. This article is a valuable contribution in that regard.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate if you read the news today, the Philippine foreign minister has in effect said that China, in a meeting with the Chinese foreign minister, told him that the only way China would negotiate is if the Philippines agrees to ignore the decision. So instead of using it as a platform, they're torpedoing it and saying, we'll only talk to you on that basis. Yeah. The Philippines says, no, if that condition is added, we're not going to talk to you. So that's sort of where it's at.
Two thoughts about that. One is that I had understood, maybe I'm not sure where I got this from, but I had understood a long time ago that the Chinese had no intention of respecting the decision, whatever it was, unless it was in their favor. That they anticipated it would not be in their favor, that they didn't have a good claim, and that they were not going to abide by it in any event. So this is not news. This is not a surprise they take the position now. The other reaction I have is that inherent in the notion in what they said to the Philippines, that they asked the Philippines to disregard the decision just the way they are disregarding a decision. That's inherently a threat, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's certainly, I think the Philippine leader, he's a new one now, Duterte, just elected. He's sort of got a rather roguish reputation, so people weren't quite sure what he was going to do because the action was brought by his predecessor. And some people call him the Donald Trump of the Philippines, the guy that's elected.
One's enough,
Yeah, sort of a loose cannon. And so the result is, people didn't quite know whether he would stand his ground, but I think the popular sentiment in the Philippines is that he should. So he disregards this judgment at his political peril.
Well, before we get back to all those points, and before we take our break, I would like to, ask you, what is the reaction in Hong Kong? What is the reaction in Asia in general? And to the extent that you can see it from there, what is the reaction in the U.S. and Europe to this decision and to the refusal of China to abide by it?
Well, I think the reaction is very positive to the decision because, there's an old principle in law that maybe no matter who wins a particular thing, just having clarity as to, principles that apply can be to everyone's advantage, sort of the spirit of the op-ed that you've read. And I think generally everyone around the world has viewed China's claims to the long stretches of the South China Sea along all of its neighbors to be excessive, and it's kind of bullying its way into these claims. And so to have them sort of slammed, I think was generally viewed favorably by most people. Here in Hong Kong was a bit of a split because we had what we call the pro-Beijing camp and the more pro-pan-democratic camp. Pan-democrats I don't think are much interested or care, but the pro-Beijing guys are all trying to give their testimonials to support the regime. So that's sort of what happens politically here. And an interesting move was Taiwan. The new leader in Taiwan has also attacked the judgment because she thinks it takes away Taiwan's, or it purports to take away Taiwan's sovereignty over Taiping Island, which is in the Spratlys. And it doesn't do that. I mean, it limits it says in effect that island is a rock, and thus it does not have an exclusive economic zone, but it does have territorial waters, and the court never decides who owns it. So it really didn't do as much harm to Taiwan's claim as Taiwan would think.
Do you think that Taiwan is just accommodating the Chinese point on this for political purposes?
It's hard to know because she's, of course, the DPP party, which is the party that doesn't get along with China. And so, the Kuomintang party has just stepped down. And so Miss Tsai has taken up office, and China has cut off all communications with her. So there's a very testy relationship going on. But they like what she did here. But at the same time, her base may not like it so much that she's getting close to China. So, all of these things have a domestic component and an external component.
Let's take a short break, Michael. It's Michael Davis, University of Hong Kong, professor of international law. We're talking here on Think Tech Asia about damage control in the South China Sea. We'll be right back. We're back. We're live. We're here with Michael Davis, joins us by Skype from Hong Kong. He's a professor of international law at the University of Hong Kong, here on Think Tech Asia. And we're talking about damage control in the South China Sea, and we're operating off an article that he wrote in the inside section of the South China Morning Post. So let's talk about some of those other points you made in the article. You talked about sovereignty. You touched on that before the break. So the Hague does not deal with questions of sovereignty. What exactly is its jurisdiction based on here, anyway?
Yeah, it's based on the UN treaty, and the UN treaty itself, the UN Treaty on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, does not address the question of sovereignty over these islands along the sea or any sovereign territorial issues. That's not a subject of the treaty. If someone wants to go to a tribunal for that, they would have to either set up a separate arbitration or go to the International Court of Justice to argue over who owns an island. And so one of the objections of China, and one the court accepts, is that it didn't have sovereignty to decide that. And so, but it did take the view that it had the power under the treaty to decide what were islands and what were not. And if something is an island, that is, it's not submerged during high tide. That sticks above the water at high tide. Then it could have territorial waters, and so it did conclude that in Scarborough and in the Spratlys there were islands. Now, among the islands, there's an article in the treaty that says that if an island is not subject to human habitation, that it's not fit for human habitation. The words are in the article there, but something of this nature, then it is classified as a rock. If it's a rock, then it only has the territorial sea, which is the 12 miles. It doesn't have the other zones, the exclusive economic zone or a continental shelf. What the tribunal held was that all of these islands in the Spratlys, these little rocks sticking up, are all rocks. And in effect, none of them have these 200-mile exclusive economic zones. And that has a big implication for the resources and stuff there. That means that whoever owns the island only controls out to 12 nautical miles and not 200 from the baseline of the island. So that was a critical part of the decision. It seems like a massive point, but I personally am a bit skeptical about how big it is. I think it's important to appreciate that these countries, all of them, have domestic political problems if they surrender territory. They surrender sovereignty over something. But from the average Joe's point of view, it's the island that you have to hold on to, not all the seas around it. The people in Japan, the right, will get incensed if Abe gives up islands. They're not going to fuss over whether he gave up some column of water somewhere. But they're going to get mad if he does that. And Xi Jinping has the same limitations, and so does Duterte in the Philippines. They all have to guard and Tsai in Taiwan. They all have to guard their islands. So the fact that these islands' sovereignty has not been decided, I don't think is an obstacle that should hang China up that much. Because at the end of the day, if China wants the resources in the area, companies are going to be given contracts and they're going to get these resources. And it may not matter that much which country is giving them the contract, because the resources are here in the region, they're going to be available, and they're going to be purchased. So it becomes, I think China maybe is not considering this carefully enough. There's been these so-called islands that have been designated rocks without 200-mile zones are still up for grabs. And if they can win them in any way by negotiated settlement or by a tribunal of some nature, then that's still there. Nothing has changed in that regard.
Now, what about Scarborough? Scarborough is not a rock. Scarborough is, a military base already. And Scarborough is an important strategical feature in that area already. Where does the decision take on that one?
The thing that's important here is Scarborough, of course, is called Scarborough Shoal. So, in a sense, if you and I were seeing its name, we would think it's all underwater during high tide. But what was interesting, and a lot of the media kind of got confused on this, was interesting is the court did say some parts stuck up above water at high tide. So some of it is islands, and that means a 12-mile nautical mile zone around it is still up for grabs, even though it's physically located in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. So Scarborough does have islands. But you're talking about buildings and stuff, artificial islands. The court does not consider artificial islands. They consider it only in the natural condition. So the court, if you read the decision going on for so many pages, it actually looks at the history of what it looked like before people started trying building things around there. And that's true of all the islands where there have been built structures. There are two of them that that in effect were handed to the Philippines, that was the appropriately named Mischief Reef, which China has built some artificial stuff on top of. That's clearly in the Philippines area, and in its natural condition never did extend above high tide. So that one and the so-called Second Thomas Shoal nearby were in effect awarded to the Philippines because they're both deemed to be below high tide elevation.
Well, you say awarded, but question is that going to stick? Is China going to disregard that too?
Well, it is. It's claiming to disregard everything.
Yeah.
I think their case for doing that is kind of slim. In effect, those are no different than the seabed, and they're very clearly inside the 200 nautical miles from Palawan Island in the Philippines. So the result is, if China wants to claim them, it's trying to intrude. What China's argument essentially was, though, is the Spratlys is within 200 miles as well. So if the Spratly Island, Taiping, were not deemed to be just a rock, then it would have 200 miles and you would have overlapping exclusive economic zones. But that didn't happen so the court dodged all of that. In the original motion to dismiss the case over jurisdiction, the court had said it would not even decide those issues until the facts were explored because it needed to determine whether that was a rock or an island. By the way, rock doesn't mean it's physically made of rock. It just means an island not fit for human habitation. And usually that if there's never been human habitation except for contrived human habitation, then it's likely it's not fit.
Well, let's address the one that really offends most people, and that is China's claim that it has some sort of inchoate historical right to this area, based on something that the 9 dotted line back when, which has no legal moment at all. But that's been their primary position, hasn't it? That they have an historical right. That's what they tell you, yeah.
Right, yeah, and that was also part of the judgment because this is it's never been clear just what is the basis for this historical right. There is a provision within the treaty that says if there are these established historical claims that they could be considered. But I can say generally these tribunals take a dim view of it because countries in those days, when it comes to uninhabited islands, really didn't care about them. They were just useless because you couldn't, take the oil or whatever from the bottom of the sea, in the 19th century. So the islands weren't really valued much. So countries that try to make out these historical claims typically rely on the fact that fishermen stopped there and so on. And tribunals, and this one included, don't take much. They take a dim view of that. That's not really a sovereignty claim. China even claims on some islands in the East China Sea that they sailed past them on their way to Okinawa. This is not a basis for sovereignty. And so it's generally thought, even before this, that these so-called 9-dash lines, which were actually 11 originally, and they were written by Taiwan, the Republic of China, would not be taken very seriously. And China's never really told the world what's the basis of those claims. And in this hearing, when the court, in this judgment, where the court goes on for 500 pages, it has a number of pages where it discusses the inadequacy of any claim based on this and argues that China has accepted the treaty. So, the treaty is coherent, but some kind of vague historical claim is not. And that was dismissed.
Now, what about this? These last couple of points you made in your article in the South China Morning Post, that is that there's been environmental damage, and the court recognized that, and that China has been trying to shoo away its patrol boats have been trying to shoo away Filipino fishermen. Where does that fit in the decision?
Well, this is really important because one thing people may not appreciate, there's over 300 articles in this UN Law of the Sea Treaty, and many of the articles deal with issues such as these. So it's an important part of the treaty to preserve the natural environment of the seas. And China, in Hawaii, I remember when I go to Hanama Bay, I'm told I'm not supposed to step on the reef, and they have these lovely little movies telling us all about the reef. Well, over here in the South China Sea, the Chinese have been blasting away at the reef, to build these artificial islands. And I thought, well, that's bad enough, and we're told that 60% of a reef is destroyed when they go about doing this. And of course, all the muck and mud and everything and sand that's stirred up may kill the reefs even further. People in Hawaii know this. But then it turns out when they want to get clams and sea turtles from underneath areas of the reef, they actually have figured out, the fishermen, and it's not the government, but the government is somewhat responsible for what they do, have figured out that they can use boat propellers to sort of drill.
Yeah, I saw that in your article. I was really dismayed about that. Well, all the equities really favor the Philippine claim here. And so I think it's a great statement that The Hague is alive and well, the tribunal is alive and well, the law of the sea is alive and well, except for China's refusal to abide by it. And I think, Michael, your suggestion that this is a good point, a platform, a starting off point for a good negotiation, that would be the only realistic solution here. And I sure hope we reach that. I sure hope that you continue to write and speak for that. We're out of time, but I want to thank you for coming around and talking about the South China Sea and the damage control. Thank you for sending the article. This is an amazing issue. We'll be covering it some more in the future. Thank you, Michael Davis, Professor of International Law at the University of Hong Kong.
Thank you, Jay. Look forward to future discussions.
Take care.